Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Stacy, and I'm a bookseller and the events coordinator at Belmont Books. Belmont Books, for those of you who are not familiar with us, is an independent and locally owned bookstore in Belmont, Massachusetts. Before we begin, I'd like to let you know that we have a number of virtual events coming up, including Marion Knapp launching her book Prohibition Wine on Tuesday, and Kathy Sherbrooke and Alexi Pappas on Wednesday. You can register for these and our other events on our website, belmontbooks.com, which is where you can also purchase tonight's book, Gold Diggers, and I will send out the link to that later. If you have any questions for the authors, please type them into the Q&A section, and we will get to as many questions as we can. We're very excited to welcome Sanjena and Chaya, right? Yeah. I want to tell you a little bit about them, and then I will turn the event over to them. A Paul and Daisy Soros Fellow, Sanjena Sathian is a 2019 graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop. She has worked as a reporter in Mumbai and San Francisco with nonfiction bylines for the New Yorker, the New York Times, Food and Wine, the Boston Globe, the San Francisco Chronicle, and more. Her award-winning short fiction has been published in Boulevard, Joyland, Salt Hill, and the Masters Review. Tonight's novel, Gold Diggers, is being adapted for television. Sanjena will co-write the adaptation, and Mindy Kaling is set to executive produce it. Sanjena was raised in Georgia by South Indian immigrant parents. She has taught creative writing to high school, college, graduate, and postgraduate level students in Iowa, Alaska, India, and New Zealand. Chaya is a practicing physician, writer, and Pan American Robert W. Bingham Debut Fiction Prize finalist for White Dancing Elephants, whose work has appeared in numerous publications. Her work was recently selected for inclusion in Best Small Fictions. Her poetry and prose juxtapose, Hindu epics, other myths and histories, and the survival of sexual harassment and racialized sexual violence by queer and other diverse women of color. And without further ado, I'm going to turn off my camera and mic and turn the event over to the people you are waiting to hear from.
Well, it's so thrilling and such a pleasure to welcome Sanjena to discuss her wonderful debut novel. It was hard. I actually sat down and wrote out questions that we'll, get into after we first hear Sanjena read, because I am from her same community, I think. I'm pretty sure. And it's quite a mirror. It's quite a unique and I think very original and lingeringly thoughtful depiction of a lot in this community that changed over years, but then there are also some constant currents. So with that as a little bit of a teaser to everyone, we're first going to have Sanjena read a selection of her choice, then turn to a few questions from me, and then audience, please have your questions ready, type them into Q&A or chat, and Stacy will help us retrieve your questions at the end and hear from Sanjena. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Stacy. I'm gonna read, and I'll just say, this is very exciting. I'm kind of nearing the end of my official book tour. This is my last bookstore event, and it has just been so wonderful to get to talk to other writers and to patronize from afar local bookstores around the country. So please support Belmont as they are reopening, and get Chaya's book there, get any other books you want there too. I'm going to read from the end of the first chapter, and the only context you need from this is the narrator, Neil Narayan, is 15 years old, and at the start of the chapter, he attended a high school dance at his large public high school, and he and his date, Anita, who is also kind of his crush and his childhood best friend, got into a fight. And so there's been a little bit of fallout from that fight. At the same dance, his sister got in trouble for drinking. At the end of May, my whole family donned our Indian clothes and headed to a big party celebrating the Putt twins' graduation. I scratched at the blue kurta my mother had made me wear. Talk on the way there focused on the honorees. Jay was Ivy League bound in the fall, while Mina would attend a state school, and not one of the better ones in my parents' eyes. Mina's fate offended my mother. "She fooled around all high school, didn't she?" my mother said to Prachi. This was the latest tactic in the wake of my sister's spring fling moral miscarriage. My mother would ask her to recite the fates of those who fooled around, which might include anything from neglecting to take AP biology to shooting up hard drugs. She educated us about the wider world by assembling a kind of shoebox diorama of other people's lives, a cardboard drama. She arranged the characters, moved them about, and showed you how they were doing it wrong, turning the diorama into the set of a morality play. Upon arriving at the Putts, I prepared to abscond to the basement. Basements were the safest places to survive an Indian party in the suburbs. In a basement, the itchy clothes could be loosened, the girls' dupattas dropped on the floor and trampled upon, the guys' kurtas removed to reveal that all along someone had been smart enough to wear a t-shirt beneath the fabric and jeans rather than churidars below. In basements, you never encountered garish images of multi-armed gods or family portraits shot in a mall photography studio, sisters draped in lengas and brothers' hair stiff with gel. In basements, you found foosball and ping pong tables, big screen televisions, and, depending on the benevolence of the parents, video game consoles. In basements, I learned the secrets of sex, according to information curated from older brothers who were certainly still virgins. In basements, a semblance of our due, American teenagedom. The Narayan family basement was, by the way, unfinished. "Lavish schmavish," my mother whispered as I made for the underground. This was her general opinion on the Putts and on any carpeting or televisions below the earth. New graduates kicked back in oversized leather recliners. Mina Putt sat on the lap of George Warner Wilson, who had spent high school as one of the only white people among Asians. He was going to Georgia Tech in the fall, where he might continue dwelling at this demographic crossroads. "Nilo, Nilium, Nilius," he said through his sinuses, saluting me. I waved. "Your crew's in the exercise room," he pointed. As I opened the door, I heard Mina sigh with a voice less damned per my mother's diorama than insouciant. "Can someone bring me something that's not frickin' Indian food?" The gym looked unused. Half the walls were mirrors. Folded up against an unmirrored wall was a treadmill draped in plastic. Mounted in one corner, a television, and beneath it, a video game console. A report of gunfire went off on screen. "Fuck you, Osama, this is America," yelled Karthik Jain as Aleem Khan's avatar, a square-jawed white soldier, expired. Anita sat cross-legged on the floor, examining a glossy magazine. She hovered a pencil above the pages, marking off answers in some quiz. "Oh, good, Neil. Everyone was wondering where you were," she said in that brisk voice of hers. Her eyes alighted on me for only an instant. Anita was a bit like a wind-up toy, capable of spinning fast for a period, laughing easily, tending to social niceties, only to run out later in private. When it was just the two of us, she'd always been slower, laxer. Amnesia, I thought viciously, ignoring me all spring, and now here she was, bending over the magazine so that I spied the top of her newly grown chest. Now Anita was turning to Aleem, saying, "You got mostly B's, so your future wife is Lauren Bennett." Giggles from Manu at the improbability. "But really, don't take it too seriously. These are designed for girls." Anita loved these games and quizzes, anything that offered a prognostication, anything to help her better articulate her future, no matter how trite. I understood why. A positive result, you'd marry Melanie Cho, could turn you briefly dreamy with a picture of a life to come. The worst result you could land in one of these divinations? Shruti Patel. "Who'd you get, Anita?" I asked. "Jake Gyllenhaal," she smirked. "Doesn't count." "That's what I said," Isha Aurora put in. "No celebrities." "Whatever," Anita said. "It's not like we know the people we're going to marry now. Like, what about the whole rest of life? I could meet Jake Gyllenhaal sometime, or whoever." "My parents met when they were 16, Juhi said. "Yeah, and got an arranged marriage." Anita gave a little shiver of revulsion, one I'd seen before when she spoke about the parents of Hammond Creek, whose lives she roundly disdained. "Anyway, it's not like I'm going to marry an Indian guy." Everything hung dead in the air for a moment, and then Juhi and Isha started to guffaw, looking around at me and Manu and Karthik and Aline. The video game was forgotten. A soldier spun on screen, displaying his machine gun impotently. I mean, no offense, Anita said to the air. Yeah, well, it's not like I'm gonna marry, Manu was saying, when in came Shruti Patel. The room stiffened at the sight of her, standing there in her wiry, frizzy manner. Her presence fractured a party. You were too aware of the sounds of her mouth breathing, the way her face contorted when she tried to participate. It required emotional labor to include her, and it was simpler to dispense with all the kindergarten rules of engagement and ignore her. That day, Shruti seemed to know more than ever these facts about herself. Those bushy eyebrows, which so often met in the middle of her forehead as she considered a problem in class, raised almost to her hairline and then flattened. She wanted us to believe that she had never given us any thought at all. Though behind her, Mrs. Putt was saying, "See, Shruti, I told you all your classmates were hiding out down here." Which was when Isha, eyes on Anita, said, "Guess who you're gonna marry, Shroots?" She and Juhi snickered. Manu's eyes met mine as we both considered intervening. But you had to save your ammo for yourself. The derision could land on you anytime. And even among friends, it had the effect of total destruction. It took so much to gather yourself up into some semblance of a person every morning. A rash of mocking could undo all that in an instant. I sat with my back against the wall and laughed as quietly as possible.
That was amazing. I will come back and ask you more about Shruti, but just want to parenthetically say, I was feeling this sadness that, you know, my kids will never fully understand the Indian party, the Indian party concept, a certain kind of Indian party where there are layers of what's happening at that party. And but I just, what I loved, I mean, this is before the planned questions. What I just loved was how you so deftly conveyed this kind of contrapuntal interaction of these worlds of the parents and the outer party, and then the way the kids construct cool in a way that is so precarious and potentially damaging at the same time. I don't think I've ever seen that before, Sanjena. I don't think people have really represented it. Like Jhumpa Lahiri refers to these parties kind of backhandedly in some of her stories, but it doesn't dissect them, and not to be catty, but I wonder, is that because she was so much one of the cool kids? There was never any space to, no, but anyway. So, okay, so the first question I have is, kind of really just the process of arriving at Neil's voice. Do you feel like he was always there, and why exactly you think it is so fraught for him to establish a self in the sense of feeling permission to do something other than doctor, engineer, lawyer? And the reason I ask this, and one really fascinating thing about this is not 1990. This book, this is 2006, when these young people are teenagers. And so that's what really surprised me, because I thought, okay, well, by then we've got, you know, Padma Lakshmi and Mindy Kaling and people in entertainment who are visible. But there are also, by then, if as you look around, pretty prominent South Asian American academics, you know, professors, or all of that. So I just, what do you think it was about Neil specifically, as you kind of wrote into his voice, that made it so fraught and so difficult for him specifically, you know, to claim a path of his own?
Yeah, well, I didn't start writing with that much of a sense of what Neil's sort of personal journey was going to be like. I started writing in his voice. I had originally written from Anita's perspective and from her mom, Anjali's perspective, and their voices just weren't working for me. I think I didn't find a sense of play or irreverence when I wrote from their perspective. But I switched and started writing from Neil's perspective, and I just knew who I was and knew what the work was once I was in his voice. And so like, I'm sure you've had versions of this before too, just when we write, so much of it is groping from the inside out. And so I think Neil's quest was sort of me working backward to say, okay, I've written this, I had written this scene that didn't end up in the final, actually I used a version of it where he was like getting dumped by a white girlfriend. And I found this an intriguing moment to sort of drop into someone's life. And I was like, how is it that I know everything about who this person is in this moment, even though I haven't written from his voice before? And I think it's because like this conflict that you're identifying, which is the sort of emotional core of the book, can Neil individuate, develop a sense of self, stake a claim on his own identity? All of those things were just pent up in me. I think that when we do talk about like a sense of self and like little brown kids knowing that they can do anything that they want, we often talk about it from the outside in and this language of the politics of representation, which rarely work for me. Because sure, like that's like a bird's eye view of like maybe something that's happening all over, you know, we can do these assessments that we always have to do. How many of us are in politics? How many of us are in media? How many of us here or there? But the truth is like when you're 15, everything about identity is so much more private and painful and insular and has so little to do with how many faces like yours you're seeing out there. And so I think for me, like, even though the novel has been discussed often as like a sort of like, it's a novel of identity because it's about ethnic identity, it's about the identity of a community. Really, it's about something that's just more fundamental, which is like, it's a coming of age novel, and a coming of age story for someone in a minority community involves them navigating their ethnic identity as well, or their racial identity as well. But it doesn't necessarily, it's not about like this question that I sort of mock throughout the book, which is like, what does it mean to be Indian and American? That's an insufficient question for Neil. For Neil, it's something more like, I have a restricted sense of who I am allowed to be because of my parents, because of the world around me, and maybe just because of like, that's the way it is to be a teenager. And like, I just want to know myself. Yeah. So I kind of backed my way into all of that.
I also think maybe the slackerdom, you know, like this sense of taking a pause and taking a step back from the frenetic activity of achievement is something that I feel like you pulled off with him without, you know, like it's really different than, have you read English August?
Yeah.
It's different than that kind of slacking, right? Which is like dedicated slacking and a lot of marijuana, you know, like it's, no, that's not what it is. But I really appreciated that because it really is an alternate way of achieving. It's achieving something else that maybe he can't yet put into words when we first meet him. So I think your explanation makes a lot of sense. Shruti seemed like just an incredibly complex and, for me, disturbingly compelling character. I think because there is this rigidity and tension and fearfulness that you convey, but not necessarily with her having that much screen time in the book, you know, but it's there. And I just wondered, had the theme of suicide in South Asian communities been something you thought about prior to writing this book? Or, you know, and I guess I also wondered if you could speak to a little bit of how it evolved, that her death kind of unlocks this transformation in Neil, and not a simple one. You know, I love that it's very nuanced and I think very subtle. So maybe just talk about her and her impact on Neil.
Sure. Again, it's another thing that I sort of like backed my way into. The conceit at the heart of the book is really about people stealing gold, and that gold being a way for them to steal ambition from each other. And I started with the gold theft, then I developed the magical sort of conceit around it pretty quickly after. And then once I realized I was writing about this stuff like ambition and achievement culture, I realized that some of the sort of ticking clock of people's energies just running out, which I think was there through the world I grew up in, that was going to have to be in the book in a bunch of different variations. So as you've mentioned, like the character Shruti is hit particularly hard with it. And there's a major tragedy at the center, literally halfway through the book. But this question of mental health, it like braids through everyone else's lives too, even if they aren't like 1 degree of separation away from that tragedy. And the reason that's there is because this is like a social realist novel in a lot of ways. And like, you have no choice but to comment upon the fabric of reality when you're doing that kind of work. And that's what the book sort of forced me to think a lot about. I think for a certain kind of Indian American, it's an almost inevitable lens to have to cast on your teenage years and your college years. This isn't the case for everyone I know, but it is the case for like more than a few, which is why I tempted to use some kind of we there. You are so alone with this like struggle to be oneself, to be like exist apart from all of your parents' baggage, and then also figure out who you are. And when you start to get language for that in your 20s, like I think in some ways it can feel frustrating because you're like, this language was there all along. Like other people got to go see therapists after school on the Upper West Side. Like how is this possible? How can it be that other people knew the phrase burnout, or knew that like it was okay to like take a mental health day? And so there's just, especially with like the dance the book kind of does between age 15 and age 26, this 10-year gap that separates part 1 from part 2. So much of what inevitably happens in those 10 years separating teenagedom from early adulthood is the gathering of language to put words to things that were previously inexpressible. And I feel like mental health is a big part of that in the communities that I come from.
I think that's not only a lovely answer, but hopefully for people who have joined us, gives them motivation and inspiration to start questioning. Maybe they don't have to normalize some very unhappy experiences, and maybe and start thinking mental health sooner. But one other thing that I also wondered is just your journalist experience and how it sort of bore on the book. And I just want to kind of point out to readers one particularly captivating thing in this book. So the beginning part, is it, I don't know, can I call it a prologue, or is it, the prologue, it's very sly and captivating. And there are all these themes, but in an original way that are kind of really fundamental sort of Indian literature themes like gender inequality, inequality and who gets educational opportunities, diaspora relationship to old world traditions, personal choice. But then there's 1980s India specifically. And this is what I want to point out, that for people who are, getting into Indian history through Sanjena's book and other books, that was the beginning of liberalization. This movement that changed India from more of a socialist economy where there was state-controlled television, no cable, no channels, no competition. Coca-Cola was kicked out. There was just a lot of anti-capitalist fervor. India was non-aligned. All of this old kind of way of thinking giving way to this trajectory that ended up in outsourcing and tech. And so I just wondered, you were up close to some of these things happening in India much more recently. What was it like translating your journalism into any part of this book?
First of all, that was a great summary of the like economic history of India from the 80s to today. So I was a journalist. I worked in San Francisco where I covered technology, and then which was not a beat that I chose by any means. I just wound up being the Silicon Valley correspondent by accident, and it was a mixed bag. And then I moved to India, and I was based out of Mumbai, out of Bombay, and I lived there for a little while. And there's nothing in the book that is like a one-to-one like thing I wrote an article about appears in the book. But journalism did, I think, covering particularly technology and really like living in the Valley and reporting on tech. That really informs the second half of the book because I got pretty up close and personal with people who I think achieved the things that I had been told were like the reasons for all of this ambition and the reasons for all of this striving. So I ran like this section of a magazine website that was a profile section, and it was this like very adulatory journalism where I had to edit and write these profiles of people that were like game changers in the industry, and so many of them were children of immigrants. A lot of them were Asian American because it's the Valley. And so I remember feeling like sometimes, okay, this person is really smart. Like I really respect their intelligence, but often I would be like, why did we do all this? Why did we fuss so hard to get here? And what was all of it for? If ultimately what you're doing is making like another social media app that just knocks off the other 5. And so like my experiences like sitting in rooms across from people who were being financially and socially lauded when I thought what they were doing was absolute bullshit. Like that is definitely there in the second half of the book. The India stuff is there also like subtly, I think. I just like didn't have much of a relationship to India until I moved there. I didn't grow up speaking an Indian language. But I always kind of wanted to understand it better. And just living in Bombay and being a person in India, apart from like being fed food at my relatives' houses and like being taken to shop for hours, like that just gave me the confidence to write a section that was set in India, even though it's like set in the 80s. And I still had to do a lot of like, I called my uncle and did a lot of interviews with him to learn what it was like to be growing up in Bombay in the 80s. But yeah, I think like journalism is great because it gives you this ability to be in a moment and also observing a moment. There's this wonderful line in The Great Gatsby, within and without, simultaneously enchanted and repelled by the inexhaustible variety of life. I feel like that's like a perfect description of what it is to do journalism and to get really close to something that is fascinating and different and have to understand it in order to sort of justify it. And that's, you take one side and then also step away long enough to write it. So it's, for me, it's more like an orientation that it taught me than any specific material it gave me.
I love that answer. And it also reminds us, also for, people with us, how much themes from the Gatsby kind of in a very original way inflect this book, very subtle, but then at the end, I felt like that last paragraph, we were also with the green light on the dock. It was like there somewhere. So my last 2 questions, I'm going to condense into one because they're kind of the standard, what are you doing next? Like what can we expect next from you? But maybe in the context of these great things we've heard about, like the adaptation that you and Mindy Kaling are doing of your work, and just, any highlights to bring out for people listening, or who might view the recorded version of this later, about just your path to, working with the agent you have, getting published, getting the deal with Mindy, and then what's coming next.
Sure. Yeah. So after doing journalism for 5 years, I went to grad school. I went to Iowa. So I wrote most of the book there, but I wasn't, that period in Iowa was not like a hyper networky, like, let me figure out publishing time. So most of my like publishing stuff happened later. So I queried agents, after I graduated, I came out of Slush and started working with Susan Gollum, who's amazing and totally legendary. And yeah, she and I worked on the manuscript for a couple of months. And as she was going out to publishers, she also sent it out to her Hollywood co-agent. And I remember her telling me pretty early, like, yeah, I told them to send it to Mindy Kaling. And I was like, okay, great. Like, I'll never hear about that ever again. But yeah, I guess the folks at Kaling International and Mindy read the book when it was in like PDF form, which like I wouldn't have done that. I would have wanted to wait. But yeah, I guess they connected with the material, and we're in really early stages right now. So we're interviewing showrunners to co-write the adaptation with me, but I will be pretty involved, being sort of like co-EP and co-writing. It's also like a really long road to actually getting something made. An option is step one. Then you have to pitch networks. And then if the networks like it, they'll tell you to go write the pilot. And then if they like that, they'll film the pilot. And if they film a satisfactory pilot, then you get your writer's room and you get to cast it and all the other stuff. It's a very, very long and dramatic process that I am only beginning to understand. But the thing I'm excited about is getting to have conversations with artists who have a completely different kind of narrative intelligence, who can look at a book and say, like, I see how it works in this form, and I also can see how to take it apart, look at its bones, and like reconstruct it, like out of time, do things that are like non-linear, create a visual language that is as important as the narrative language. Like, I'm just learning a lot from the people who I'm getting to talk to about everything now. So yeah, it's early stages, but I'm hopeful that will take up some of my time this year. And I'm also writing new fiction, but I'm very superstitious. I don't know if you're like this. I never talk about what I'm working on.
So with that, we're going to turn it over to audience questions. And I think, Stacy, if you want to read some questions for us, that would be great. And then, yep, and then we'll just see where that goes.
Great. So we have one from Monica, who said, love your book. I'm an Indian American writer. I have a question about writing for you. Any recommendations you'd give in terms of knowing whether your idea is worth pursuing? In an earlier talk, you mentioned your novel premise was originally a short story. Wondering what made you feel confident and how you'd advise others to know it's worth persisting with an idea.
Yeah, thank you for reading, Monica. For the context for those of you who haven't been, watching my other docs, which thank you for watching the other doc. This Gold Diggers was originally a short story that I turned in for a graduate school workshop. It did not land. It was kind of a disaster. And the criticism people delivered, particularly the professor, was pretty harsh, but accurate. Like it didn't function as a short story. But the professor and a friend of mine who's in the class, they both sort of separately were like, this conceit is really interesting. Like, go back, keep playing with it. And so I did. And the thing that one of my friends and readers said to me was, he was like, that story didn't work, but the gold thing, like that could sustain a Chabon novel. And I remember being like, oh, I see that. And he was like, you do your thing. I know you're mostly writing short stories right now, but like, think about it. And I only really knew that this book could be a novel when I found Neil's voice, because I had the conceit and then I had the voice. And then I also had the space to try and fail because I had this graduate program. And I think that's really hard to do outside of a space where people aren't like validating you or giving you just like the strength to carry on. So the like generalizable principles I can take from that is like, one, like it's really useful to have readers, and it's as useful to have readers who are harsh as it is to have readers who tell you to carry on. And two, like I think like a lot of people start out by saying like, I have to write a novel because like that's what sells. And like, it would have been really bad to force any of my other short stories into a novel form. And in some cases, like I tried that and I needed to respect that they belonged in a different shape. And so I don't think it's a dichotomy between like, find the strength to carry on and like, it'll be a novel. I think it's like, listen to the material. It's very mystical, but like the material itself will tell you what shape it needs to be. But I think writing groups are helpful for that. You have to find the right couple of trusted readers, but when I am stuck in my own head, I turn to those people. And a lot of what we end up doing is talking about literature in general. We're not necessarily even talking about each other's work. We're saying like, okay, maybe you're about to give up on this novel that you are sick of, but tell me about like that favorite book of yours. What does it do that you love? And aren't its virtues exactly the things that you are despairing about in your own work? So just having that community to talk through the reason you love reading with, like, I think that is all the stuff around like how to actually keep going with an idea and knowing whether to toss it and when to hold on to it.
Great. Anybody else have questions? Well, I have one. Maybe you could each tell us what you're reading right now.
I just finished Christine Smallwood's debut, The Life of the Mind, which I really enjoyed. It's very intelligent. It does this stuff with this sort of like hysterical Victorian woman trope in the 21st century. And there's a completely chilling scene, couple of scenes about abortion that are both really funny and also really human. Would definitely recommend it. Chaya, what are you reading?
I have to admit, I cannot stop reading the coverage of the conflict, Israel, Palestine. I find it quite gutting. I won't go off on a tangent, but I do recommend for people to not look away and stay on top of it. You know, we're involved whether we want to be or not as US taxpayers, is what I'm coming to realize. But in terms of books, I would say a strikingly lovely, I read two amazing things that I want to shout out. One is Savage Tongues by Azarine van der Vliet Ulumi. Oh my God, it's so good. You have to go and read it. It's just this incredible book about, it's in the voice of a 30-something woman who goes back to a part of Spain where when she was 17, she had kind of a question consent versus coerced relationship with an older man. And it's really accomplished. I can't say enough about that, the success of that voice, similar to Sanjena's novel with the success of Neil's voice. It's just a very realized voice. And then the other book that I think is really going to blow your head off is Dear Centuron by Aqua Aki. I'm always an Emetsi, I think is how you pronounce their name. They are partly also from the same community that Sanjena and I are from. They are Tamil and Nigerian. Am I right? Are you not Tamil? Did I get it wrong?
No, I'm not Tamil.
You're not Tamil, but you're South Indian.
South Indian, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So that's so they are also South Indian, and so I would like read Gold Diggers and then read that book, and it's so interesting how differently the diaspora can be reflected in different experiences. So those two books are really terrific.
Great, thank you both for answering that.
Of course, buy them from Belmont Books.
Yeah. Casey, what are you reading?
What am I reading? So I spend a lot of time reading books that aren't out yet because I can, which is really exciting. And the one that I'm reading now is called The Sweet Sisters, and it's not coming out until the end of the year, but it's basically about these two sisters who get put into show business by their parents with the false notion that they are Siamese twins. they are actually twins, but they are not Siamese twins, but their father constructs all these outfits so that they look like they're Siamese twins. And, you know, this is all just a whole showbiz kind of gimmick. And of course they get found out and it goes on from there. So interesting premise. Thank you for asking. Nobody's ever asked me before. Chaya, did you have any other questions that you wanted to ask?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't want to take away from time for people, but I did get kind of excited because I was writing out all these different questions, and one of them was kind of more another craft question for Sanjena. Just speaking in general about how you arrived at the structure of your book and the decision to, you know, you spoke a little bit about developmentally in the characters' lives, that 10-year gap, but just the back and forth structure, staying in one voice versus being told from many, you know, many different voices. Just anything you want to say about structure, and just which authors have really influenced you the most, either for this work or more generally.
Yeah, I mean, structure is one thing that I feel like you just have to crib from everyone. I looked at All the King's Men, which was a serious sort of like structural, that was like a structural corollary for this novel, because it's a first person novel that spans a decent bit of time. I ended up deciding that Robert Penn Warren was too talented for me to try to knock off. I could not do in this book what he does with time. But that was useful because you have to figure out what it takes to have a novel's voice be sort of innocent when it needs to be innocent, and then wise when it needs to be wise. And when it's one person telling that story, how can you move through those ranges and registers? And structure is one of the ways that you do, right? It's like, in this time period, I can identify where this character is, and I can identify the mood and the sort of milieu that they'll be entering. And so that structurally walls itself off as kind of one room within the novel, and then you move between those rooms. But All the King's Men was one of those books. Zadie Smith is very much in me in terms of voice, though not structure, because I think most of her books happen in these like much like neater. It's like parts 1 through 4 in White Teeth, and like 4 parts in NW. And this is a 2-part book. I also looked a lot at A Tale for the Time Being by Ruth Ozeki, which is not at all structured like this. It's got 2 narrators. There's the narrator of this teenage girl who's written a diary, and then the second narrator is the writer who finds the diary when it's washed up on a beach. But what's interesting about that book is it weaves in history, just like All the King's Men does. These 2 books weave in history in this way that's just sort of like a little Easter egg, but it doesn't take you too far away from the main narrative. And so I looked a lot at those books as well for the very brief section set in the California Gold Rush for gold diggers. Yeah.
We have a question from Natalia, who said she thinks it's fascinating and awesome the moment at which gold diggers came out, when more people than in recent times started publicly engaging in issues of race, and especially the South Asian community. A big conversation started about whether or not South Asians should or are considered part of POC. I'm in medicine and frequently I'm trying to reconcile how we're minorities in the US, but there is this phrase overrepresented in medicine. I'm not sure if that's a question per se, just curious your thoughts and how you noticed your work was received in the context of this national moment.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that's tricky about novels in coming out in any given moment is they were never written in that moment, or any book, right? Like it just takes so long for a book to come out that the environment in which it's received has almost nothing to do with the environment in which it was written. So I was writing this before it was cool to be concerned about the model minority myth, right? I was writing it before I had any of this like public language that we now have. And I agree with you, Natalia. I think a lot of that language has sort of like gotten really amped up in the last year. But I officially started writing this in 2017, but I really was like working on it for many years before that. And I think that says something about like just, I guess I try to take a step back in these moments and ask us all to consider like what the purpose of fiction is in a moment where we are discussing political identities. And my proposition is that fiction is more private and more intimate and ultimately less functional. It does less social work than I think people want it to do. Ultimately, like the work of figuring out whether or not we are or not people of color, like that's work that I sort of like would defer to organizers on because I'm just not one. What I do think fiction is good at is helping us like articulate something about our collective imagination. And like one thing that writing this novel helped me do was finally put words to like the places where my community's imagination of itself and of America and of race in America, where it failed, where we could sort of start to like flick at it and see that it would fall over, where it turned out to be flimsy. And that's just a thing that if you enter this book and you're just at the dinner table with these characters and getting high with Neil in the second half, if you're just in that world, you'll see how those people's concerns relate to the questions of today, but none of them are resolved, because that's one of the things that I think art asks us to do, is not resolve in the space of 200, 300 pages, but like take whatever is stirred up with you off the page. So having the book come out in this moment has been tricky because I've both had the opportunity to speak about things that I think people didn't necessarily want to listen to a few years ago. Like I've really appreciated that there's been more interest in people saying, okay, can you come and write for us about like what this model minority myth means? And then I can engage with a lot of the ideas that you're bringing up, Natalia. I can write to and for our community and say like, let's have this conversation. I would not have had the opportunity to even participate in that conversation a few years ago. On the flip side, I think it's hard for novelists to be, to feel like our work is ever in conversation with just one moment, because you want people to care about this stuff longer, and beyond just the news cycle, beyond just it's Asian American Pacific Heritage Month, so let's commission a piece by a brown person because we like forgot to do that last month. So it's tricky. I still haven't figured out how to inhabit it, but I think we're probably making progress. More people are reading my book, I think, with a sort of openness than they might have read it before.
Great. Well, I don't see any other questions.
I have one follow-up comment to Natalia's important question. I just want to point out, I do think, though, Sanjena, I completely appreciate so much how it's not novelistic intention, to sort of say, let me tell you what this headline means. It's absolutely not. On the other hand, there's so many lovely nuanced moments in the book about race, like pretty for an Indian, or what the external pressure that drives the dread and fear of the parents is. Well, it's a fear of being erased and not being able to hack it in the new world, right? So I think that's important. But Natalia, also just speaking factually to your point, I want to take this opportunity to tell you something that I wish I had known sooner, which is it is a lie that we are overrepresented. It's actually a lie. So Asian Americans comprise 6% of the United States population. And in the latest AAMC survey, the level of over-representation is not more than 4 to 5%, i.e., the number of Asian American physicians in that survey is not that much more than the number of Asian Americans in the general population. And the predominant majority of physicians in this country, as one example, people in medicine, are white men, not white women, not other women of color, not Asian Americans. It's white men. So just to be really, really clear who is overrepresented.
Thank you for that. I think that is something good for us to all think about as we leave tonight. And thank you both so much for this great event. It was really a pleasure, and we thank everybody for coming out. We hope to see you at future events, and we hope that you all stay well and healthy.
Thank you for having us. Bye.
Our pleasure. Good night.